They found Sister Magdalena's voice box crushed flat when she was 19, the cartilage pressed inward like a boot heel on a tin cup, and the doctor in Galveston said she would never speak again. That was 1856. What the doctor did not say, because he could not have known, was that silence would become the most dangerous thing on the Oregon coast. The convent of St. Clair released her on a Tuesday in March of 1861, not with cruelty but with the particular softness institutions use when they have already made up their minds. Sister Superior touched Magdalena's wrist and said, "We cannot keep a nun who frightens the novices." The young sisters had complained, not about the silence itself, but about the way Magdalena watched them, the way she moved through corridors without footfall, the way animals followed her across the courtyard and pressed their skulls against her palms as though receiving communion. One novice had woken screaming after finding Magdalena standing motionless at the foot of her bed at 3 a.m, one hand resting on the dormitory cat, both of them staring with the same flat, patient expression. She was 30 miles south of Astoria when she found the lighthouse. The road was not a road. It was a goat trail cut through Sitka spruce so dense the branches interlocked overhead like the ribs of a cathedral that had fallen on its side. The fog that day smelled of kelp and rust and something faintly chemical like the residue inside an emptied laudanum bottle. The lighthouse sat on a basalt promontory, its lantern room dark, its gunnery railing orange with corrosion. The keeper had died of drink the previous winter. No one had come to replace him. The lighthouse board had written it off. Too remote, too expensive. Let the ships find their own way. Magdalena climbed the 53 iron steps to the top and looked out at nothing. The fog was so thick she could not see the ocean, though she could hear it, a sound like a massive animal breathing in its sleep. She set her canvas sack on the gallery floor. She owned a wool blanket, a leather-bound Bible with her mother's name inside the cover, a filleting knife, and $11 in coin. She was 24 years old. The people who had known her would have said she had nothing. They stopped saying that after the first wolves came. The initial pair arrived in September of that year, during a storm that bent the spruce trees nearly horizontal and drove salt spray through the gaps in the lighthouse door. Magdalena heard them before she saw them, not howling, whimpering. She opened the door and found 2 gray wolves on the stone threshold, both young, both soaked, their ribs showing through matted fur like the slats of a broken fence. One had a porcupine quill driven through its lower lip. The other was missing most of its left ear, the wound still wet and dark. She pulled the quill with the filleting knife heated over her driftwood fire, pinching the barbed end flat before drawing it through. The wolf did not bite her. It trembled against her knee and made a sound in its throat like water draining from a basin. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and sea moss, the same preparation her grandmother had used on pig bites in County Kerry 40 years before anyone in this story was born. The wolves did not leave. By the following spring there were 5. By 1865 there were 9. By 1870 the pack numbered 14, and the fishermen in the village of Breaker Bay, 6 miles north along the coast, had begun telling stories. The mute witch in the dead lighthouse. The woman who ran with wolves. Old Pete Harmon, who operated the general store and served as the town's unofficial authority on everything he did not understand, told anyone who would listen that she was a danger. "Those animals will turn on her," he said, leaning on his counter with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders. "And then they will turn on us. She ought to be driven out." Nobody drove her out. Not because they disagreed with Pete, but because nobody wanted to walk 6 miles through wolf territory to deliver the message. The fog never lifted in those years. The Oregon coast had always been foggy, but the stretch between Breaker Bay and the lighthouse existed in a different category of obscurity. Ships avoided it. The lighthouse board had decommissioned the light. Magdalena and her wolves lived inside a permanent white blindness, visible to no one, watched by nothing except the sea and the spruce trees and the particular quality of silence that accumulates in places humans have decided to forget. Also, she believed. The discovery happened in her 3rd year, and it changed everything that came after, though she did not understand how much until decades later. She had been digging a drainage trench behind the lighthouse to redirect the rainwater that pooled against the foundation and seeped through the mortar every winter. A shovel struck something that was not rock and was not root. It was a plank. Beneath the plank was a second clang. Beneath that was a shaft, roughly 4 feet square, dropping straight down into darkness that smelled of mineral water and warm stone. She lowered herself on a knotted rope, her feet finding iron rungs driven into the rock wall at irregular intervals, clearly placed by someone who had descended this way many times. At the bottom, 16 feet below the surface, the shaft opened into a natural cavern the size of a modest church. The floor was smooth basalt, the walls glistened with moisture, and in the far corner, steaming gently in the darkness, a thermal spring bubbled up through a crack in the rock and collected in a natural basin roughly 8 feet across and 3 feet deep. The water was 104 degrees. She tested it with her wrist the way her mother had tested bathwater for infants. The warmth rose through the cavern in soft currents, and even standing at the entrance she could feel the temperature difference. Outside it was 41 degrees and raining. Down here it was 68 and dry except for the spring itself. Someone had lived here before. Against the south wall she found a shelf carved directly into the basalt, and on it 3 clay jars sealed with beeswax, still intact. Inside the first, dried salmon packed in salt. Inside the second, rendered bear fat, still white, still usable. Inside the third, a collection of small objects. A whalebone comb, a thimble made from a musket ball, a folded piece of oilskin containing a charcoal drawing of a woman's face, her hair in 2 long braids, her expression the particular kind of calm that comes after a person has already survived the worst thing that will ever happen to them. There was no letter, no explanation, no convenient narrative, just the evidence of someone who had known about the hot spring and the cavern and had used them and had left or died or simply stopped coming. Magdalena never learned who. She studied the drawing for a long time in the light of the tallow candle she had brought down with her. Then she folded the oilskin closed and put it back on the shelf. It was not her story to open. What she did instead was think. The cavern solved the problem that had nearly killed her twice in 3 winters. The lighthouse was made of stone and iron, materials that conducted cold the way a wire conducts electricity. No amount of driftwood fire in the keeper's quarters could keep the temperature above freezing when the Pacific storms came in January and February, when the wind found every crack and the fog froze on the gallery railing in sheets of ice so heavy they bent the iron. She had survived by sleeping between wolves, their body heat the only insulation she had. But the wolves were restless sleepers. They dreamed of running, and their legs kicked and their teeth snapped at nothing, and she had the scars on her forearms to prove it. The cavern was different. The geothermal spring maintained its temperature regardless of what the weather did on the surface. The basalt walls held the warmth. The earth itself was insulation, 16 feet of it above her head, doing what earth has always done, keeping the inside separate from the outside, holding steady while the world above went mad. She began the work in May of 1864. First she widened the shaft entrance and built a proper frame around it, using timber salvaged from a wrecked schooner she found half buried in the sand a mile south. She fitted a trap door that could be sealed from inside, using the ship's brass hinges, still bright and functional despite the salt water. Below, she expanded the shelf system, carving additional niches into the basalt with a cold chisel she had traded for in Breaker Bay, the only time she entered the town. Pete Harmon had watched her from behind his counter as she placed the chisel and a spool of wire on the wood and pushed across her coins without meeting his eyes. He took the money and said nothing to her. But after she left, he said to his wife, who was sorting buttons in the back room, "She looked at me like I was the one who was lost." His wife said, "Maybe you are." He did not speak to his wife for the rest of the day, which was unusual because Pete Harmon normally had opinions about everything, including buttons. The food preservation system she built in the cavern used principles that pioneer women on the overland trails had understood for decades, but that Breaker Bay, with its abundance of fresh fish and its complacent proximity to the sea, had never bothered to learn. She packed salmon in alternating layers of salt and dried moss inside the clay jars, sealing them with a mixture of rendered fat and beeswax that created an anaerobic seal. Anything sealed this way would keep for 18 months. She hung venison in the upper part of the shaft, where the temperature hovered at a constant 50 degrees, cool enough to cure but warm enough to prevent freezing. She built a smoking rack at the cavern entrance where the natural draft drew air upward through the shaft, carrying smoke from green alder chips across strips of elk meat suspended on wire. The smoke flavored the meat and the airflow dried it. No flies could reach it 16 feet underground. The walls adapted to the cavern immediately. They descended the shaft on the iron rungs with a grace that should not have been possible for animals with no thumbs, their claws finding purchase on the metal, their bodies compressing and stretching through the narrow opening with the liquid flexibility of cats. They slept on the warm basalt near the spring. In winter, the entire pack moved underground, 14 wolves and 1 silent woman arranged around a hot spring in a cave beneath a dead lighthouse on a coast no one could see through the fog. She taught herself masonry by studying the lighthouse walls. She taught herself carpentry by disassembling the wrecked schooner plank by plank and rebuilding its useful parts below ground. She taught herself herbalism from the plants that grew in the particular microclimate around the hot spring surface outlet, where warm water met cold air and created a permanent growing season. Wintergreen, wild ginger, a species of fern she had no name for that tasted like black pepper and grew nowhere else she ever found. By 1871, 10 years into her residency, the cavern system extended to 3 interconnected chambers. The main chamber with the hot spring, a storage chamber she had excavated from a natural fissure in the rock, its walls lined with salvaged chip timber, its shells holding enough preserved food to last 8 months. And a third chamber, smaller, where she slept on a platform of cedar planks elevated above the floor, the warmth from the spring drifting through a natural gap in the stone wall, like breath from a sleeping body. Wrecker Bay ignored her with the thoroughness of people who have decided that someone does not exist. Fishermen occasionally spotted wolves on the promontory and crossed themselves. Children dared each other to walk south on the coast trail, but none of them ever got farther than the stand of Sitka spruce, where the trees closed overhead and the light changed to something green and submarine. Pete Harmon, who was now 63 and suffered from gout that made his left ankle swell to the size of a grapefruit every February, maintained his position that the mute woman and her wolves were a menace. But his certainty had acquired a strange edge over the years, a quality his wife recognized but could not name, something that might have been doubt wearing the clothes of conviction. Then the fog lifted. It happened on the morning of November 14, 1891. Magdalena was 54 years old. She had lived in the lighthouse for 30 years. She had raised 3 generations of wolves. She had not spoken a word in 35 years. Not since the night in Galveston when a man whose name she had trained herself to forget had put his hands around her throat and pressed until something inside her broke. The fog cleared in a matter of minutes, rolling back from the coast like a curtain being drawn from a window, and for the first time in 3 decades the promontory was visible from Breaker Bay. The lighthouse stood bone-white against a sky so blue it looked artificial. The gallery railing, which she had maintained and repainted with a mixture of linseed oil and iron oxide, gleamed dull red, and on the rocks below the lighthouse, visible now with terrible clarity, sat 14 wolves in a semicircle, all of them facing inland, all of them watching something. Not something, someone. The fisherman who first noticed it was a young man named Thomas Carey, 19 years old, son of the Carey who ran the boatyard. He was mending a net on the dock when the fog pulled back and the promontory appeared like a photograph developing in solution, and he saw the wolves, and he saw what the wolves were watching, and he dropped his shuttle and ran for Pete Harmon's store because Pete was the person you told when something was wrong, even though Pete was 83 now and could barely stand. What Thomas had seen, and what the rest of Breaker Bay confirmed when they gathered on the bluff with telescopes and field glasses borrowed from the harbor master, was this. On the coast trail between the town and the lighthouse, roughly 2 miles from each, there was a man. He was sitting on a rock. He had been sitting on that rock based on the condition of his camp for what appeared to be a very long time. Weeks, possibly months, yam. He had a canvas tent. He had a fire ring. He had a brass telescope on a tripod, aimed directly at the lighthouse. He had been watching her. The man's name, they learned later, was Edward Cahill. He was a representative of the United States Lighthouse Board, sent 18 months earlier to assess whether the decommissioned station could be recommissioned for the increasing ship traffic that the expansion of the Pacific timber trade had brought to the coast. He had arrived in the fog and found it impossible to approach the lighthouse due to the wolves. So he had camped and watched, and written in a leather journal that would eventually fill 600 pages with observations of a mute woman who lived underground with a wolf pack, grew herbs in November, and maintained a lighthouse she had no authority to maintain, keeping the gallery railing from rusting, keeping the steps clear, keeping the lantern room glass clean, as though she were waiting for someone to give her permission to light it. He had also written to the lighthouse board requesting that she be removed. The letter had not been sent. It sat in his journal, between pages 4/2012 and 4/13, folded but unsealed. He had written it 4 months into his observation. He had not sent it because on page 414 he had written a single sentence that explained everything and explained nothing. She is more careful with this light than any keeper I have observed in 22 years of service. The storm that arrived 3 days after the fog lifted was the worst in recorded history on that stretch of coast. The fishermen called it the November gale, though it was not a gale. It was something older and less nameable, a wall of wind and water that came from the southwest at speeds that tore the roof off Pete Harmon's store and drove the fishing fleet onto the rocks and collapsed 11 of Breaker Bay's 14 buildings like they were made of playing cards. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The rain turned to sleet and the sleet turned to ice, and the ice coated everything. Every surface, every rope, every exposed piece of skin, with a glaze that burned like acid. Pete Harmon's wife, whose name was Ruth, and who had spent 40 years being the quiet correction to her husband's loud errors, was the one who said it. She said it standing in the wreckage of their store, her white hair plastered flat against her skull, her hands bleeding from the broken glass she had been clearing. The gout medication she had been measuring for Pete scattered across the wet floor in a paste of white powder and rainwater. She said, "The lighthouse." Pete looked at her. His face did something complicated. It moved through several expressions in the space of a breath, and one of them, brief and unguarded, was shame. He had spent 20 years calling the mute woman a menace. He had spent 20 years warning that the wolves would turn. He had spent 20 years being certain in the way that only a man who has never been tested can be certain. And now his store was gone, and his neighbors were injured, and the wind was still climbing, and the only structure on this coast built to withstand exactly this kind of storm was the lighthouse he had wanted to tear down. "Ruth," he said. She waited. She knew this voice. It was the voice he used when he was about to admit something that cost him. She cannot possibly. He started and then stopped, because the truth was that he did not know what the mute woman could possibly or could not possibly do. He had never asked. He had never walked the 6 miles to find out. He had built his entire opinion of her from a distance, which is the natural habitat of opinions. They walked. 31 people, the surviving population of Breaker Bay, walked south through the storm on the coast trail, leaning into the wind at angles that would have been comical in any other context. Pete Harmon walked with a cane made from a boat hook, his gout foot wrapped in canvas, his face set in an expression that was not pride and was not humility but was something in between, something that had no name because it was specific to the experience of walking toward a person you have wronged to ask them to save you. Edward Cahill joined them on the trail. He fell into step beside Pete without speaking. He was carrying his leather journal inside his coat, pressed against his chest like a child. The wolves met them a quarter mile from the lighthouse. 14 gray shapes materialized out of the sleet and stood in the trail, blocking it, their eyes reflecting the strange silver light that storms produce. The people of Breaker Bay stopped. Several of them made sounds that were not words. Thomas Carey, who was at the front because he was young and did not yet understand that bravery and foolishness share a border, took 1 step forward and one of the wolves showed its teeth. Then Magdalena appeared. She came down the trail from the lighthouse, moving through the wolves without touching them, and they parted for her the way water parts for a stone that has always been in the river. She was 54 years old. Her hair was iron gray and cut short against her skull. She was wearing a coat made from elk hide she had tanned herself, dark with rain, and her hands, which were broad and scarred and capable, hung at her sides. She looked at the 31 people standing in the storm, and she did not smile, and she did not frown. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has been alone for 30 years and understands that being alone and being abandoned are different things, and that only one of them is a choice. She gestured. It was a simple movement, one hand raised and then turned palm up toward the lighthouse. Can. The wolves turned and walked with her, and the people of Breaker Bay followed, because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. The cavern held them all. It was not comfortable. 31 people and 14 wolves in 3 chambers designed for one woman and her pack. But it was warm. The hot spring kept the air at 68 degrees, while the storm outside drove the surface temperature to 11. The walls did not shake. The earth did not move. 16 feet of basalt and soil absorbed the fury of the storm, the way a mother absorbs a child's tantrum, without effort, without comment, simply by being too solid to be moved. Magdalena fed them. She opened the clay jars and the smoked meat stores and the dried herbs, and she made a broth in an iron pot hung over a fire she built at the base of the shaft, where the natural draught carried the smoke upward and out. The broth was salmon and wild ginger, and the peppery fern and something else none of them could identify, something that tasted green and alive, and it was the best thing any of them had ever eaten. Though that might have been the cold talking. Pete Harmon sat against the cavern wall with his gout foot elevated on a rolled blanket that Magdalena had placed under it, without being asked. A wolf lay next to him, its head on its paws, its flank warm against his hip. Pete looked at the wolf. The wolf looked at Pete. Pete said very quietly to no one in particular, "I was wrong." Ruth, sitting across the chamber, heard him. She reached over and put her hand on his ankle, on the swollen joint that had caused him pain for 20 years, and she held it there, and she did not say, "I told you so," because some kindnesses are better than being right. They stayed for 9 days. On the 4th day, Edward Cahill opened his journal and tore out the letter requesting Magdalena's removal. He folded it into a small square and fed it to the fire. Magdalena watched him do it. Their eyes... He was a man who had spent 18 months watching her from a distance, cataloguing her competence, measuring her worthiness against standards she had never agreed to be measured by. He opened his mouth to say something. An apology, maybe. An explanation. But she shook her head, a single, slow movement, and he understood that she did not need his words. She had never needed anyone's words. Words were the currency of people who could spend them. On the 9th day the storm broke, and they emerged from the shaft into a world scraped clean. The lighthouse stood. The gallery railing gleamed red. The spruce trees had lost their upper branches and stood like columns holding up nothing. Breaker Bay was rebel, but everyone was alive. In his final report to the Lighthouse Board, Edward Cahill recommended that the station be recommissioned and that its keeper be formally appointed. He recommended Sister Magdalena. He noted her 30 years of unpaid maintenance. He noted the survival infrastructure she had built. He noted the wolves, which he described with the dry precision of a government man who has seen something that exceeded his categories, as auxiliary personnel. The board approved the appointment. They sent a new Fresnel lens. They sent a salary. They sent an official letter addressed to Keeper Magdalena, no surname given, which she could not read aloud at the small ceremony. Breaker Bay held on the promontory because she could not speak, so Ruth Harmon read it for her while Pete stood in the back with his cane and his complicated face and his gout and his wolf, because one of the wolves had followed him home after the storm and slept on his porch every night, and he had not chased it away. Magdalena lit the lens that evening. The beam cut through the November dark and swept across the water in a slow arc, and the ships that had been avoiding this stretch of coast for 30 years saw it and corrected their courses. And the sailors on those ships did not know that the light they were steering by was kept by a woman who could not call out to them, who could only send this one bright syllable across the water, again and again a word in the language that needed no voice. The hot spring still steams in the cavern beneath the lighthouse. You can find it if you know where to dig. The iron rungs are rusted now, but they hold. The clay jars are empty. The whalebone comb is in a museum in Portland behind glass beside a placard that says, "Found at Cape Sorrow Light Station circa 1860, origin unknown." The charcoal drawing of the woman with 2 braids is not in the museum. Magdalena kept it on the shelf where she found it, face down, protected by its oilskin, belonging to whoever comes next. On the gallery railing, if you look closely, you can see where the rust was scraped away and painted over, year after year, for 3 decades, by hands that never once asked to be thanked. The paint is red. It is always red. It is the color of iron oxide mixed with linseed oil, which is the color of something that refuses to disappear.